Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kayla Rogers, and I am the Program Supervisor at the Women's Fund. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit located here in Houston, and our mission is to provide women and girls with the tools they need to be advocates for their health. So we do this through focused seminars like today's presentation, as well as curriculum-based classes and publications. All of our presentations and publications are free. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to visit our website, thewomensfund.org, where you can also download free PDF versions of our publications. So today, we are lucky enough to have Dr. Kara Winkler here to talk to us about healthy communication for healthy relationships. There we go. We have two screens up, so bear with us. So before I pass the mic over to Dr. Winkler, I want to give a brief introduction. So Dr. Kara Winkler is an assistant professor in communication studies at the University of Houston downtown. She has a PhD in interpersonal communication and teaches courses on relational communication, gender and communication, and intercultural communication. Her research focuses on sexual health and disclosure in close relationships across the lifespan, which she has presented at over 20 national and international conferences and published in top-tier journals such as Communication Monographs, Human Communication Research, and the Journal of Family Theory and Review. So we are so grateful to have Dr. Winkler here today, and we're going to go ahead and turn the floor over to her so she can get started with her presentation.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. So as you mentioned, I am Kara Winkler, and today I'm going to talk to you about healthy communication for healthy relationships. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. All right, so that's the topic of today's seminar. And so I thought we'd take a minute and just go over a quick preview of what we're going to cover in today's talk. So of course, if we're going to be talking about healthy relationships and healthy communication, well, we should probably figure out what are those characteristics. What does a healthy close relationship look like? So we're going to talk about what are some of the benefits that we get out of close relationships. What are some things that we gain? Kind of what needs do we have fulfilled in our close relationships? We're also going to talk about, sorry, that was a question. We're also going to go over relational maintenance communication. So we're going to talk about some of the specific types of behaviors that we can engage in that help to contribute to the overall health of our relationships, and also talk about some of those less healthy communication behaviors that we like to try to avoid or prevent, or sometimes even repair if they've already happened. And speaking of those issues and problems, we're going to talk about conflict management strategies and some skill sets that we can really cultivate to help make those conflicts more constructive and more productive. And then, of course, after we have any harm or damage done to our relationships, we need to be able to repair and rebuild our relationships. So we're going to talk about some skills specifically focused on repairing and rebuilding. Some examples there about apologies and forgiveness, how to frame apologies and how to ensure forgiveness. So let's go ahead and get into those characteristics of healthy close relationships. So close relationships, we know, there's all different types of close relationships, right? And so we can think about this big umbrella of close relationships as any type of relationship where it's marked by behavioral interdependence, meaning we depend on one another for resources, to accomplish tasks, to meet our needs, to accomplish our goals. We also have a level of mutual influence, meaning we can consider each other's thoughts and perspectives when making decisions. We also have unique interaction patterns that are repeated over time. So there's this unique and irreplaceable element to our close relationships, right? We can't just sub in somebody else. This is somebody who is really close to us. We have an emotional attachment, an enduring bond, and a desire to really maintain that relationship, to stay in the relationship. So you understand each other's psychological makeup. You have a special place in each other's thoughts and feelings. So that's the big kind of umbrella of close relationships. So of course, this could be romantic relationships, marital relationships, it could also be siblings, it could be best friends, it could be cousins, it could be parent-child, adult parent-child relationships. And when we look at all of these different relationships, we essentially go into our close relationships in an effort to accomplish three needs, or to have three main needs fulfilled. The first is affectionate communication. So affectionate communication is a resource that helps to strengthen our relationships and makes people feel better about themselves and about others. The next is social inclusion. So we like to feel included. Feeling included is a crucial part of social development that enables us to have successful interactions and associations with other people. And then this last need that we get fulfilled in our close relationships has to do with behavioral control. So we know that we're really successful in relationships when we share control in that relationship. So maybe this is about decision-making surrounding work or money, or maybe sex, or childcare, or household chores. When we come at it together, that helps to fulfill our need of behavioral control and autonomy. So these needs of affection, social inclusion, and behavioral control can be fulfilled in many different types of relationships. And these relationships can be broken down into these different categories, specific types, as I mentioned, coworkers, friends, marital partners, siblings, and so forth. We can also think of it in terms of how mainstream or typical they are. Maybe it's a multiracial or a biracial relationship. Maybe it's an LGBTQ relationship. So we have to consider all of these different characteristics and dynamics of a relationship when we're trying to aim for a healthy communication in our healthy relationship. In addition to that, there are some kind of indicators that we can think about when we look at close relationships as either being voluntary or involuntary. So think about involuntary, these are your family of origin, your siblings, your aunts and uncles. But we also have our voluntary close relationships, our family, our friends, our romantic partners, right? The people we choose to have as a close relationship. It could also be genetically related or not genetically related by blood or by law. We can also consider elements of if there's any sexual activity involved or romantic intent involved. And so those are some other elements that can shift and change the way that we interact with one another, whether or not there's romance or sexual activity going on. Another interesting component to look at that I think is really relevant for today's group, it has to do with masculine and feminine characteristics within friendships. So what we know about masculine and feminine friendships, or typically those among men and women, is that the differences are perhaps best articulated in cross-sex friendships. So when I'm friends with a man, what does that relationship look like? Well, we know in same-sex friendships among women, women's friendships are very expressive. They're built on and maintained through an evolving dialogue, this connection. As women, we're socialized to be attentive and emotionally supportive and caring. That's what we're supposed to do. Men's friendships, on the other hand, tend to develop more of a closeness in doing. So they do activities together. Where talking isn't necessarily everything. So it's more about side-by-side activities and sharing in tasks. So you can see just when we look at these basic masculine versus feminine orientations to relationships, we bring some different types of priorities and needs that we need fulfilled in these. When it comes to those cross-sex friendships, women tend to benefit from these cross-sex friendships because they're less emotionally intense. Women kind of get a reprieve when they're friends with men because they don't have to talk about all that heavy emotional stuff. And conversely, men get an emotional support and a release when they're friends with women. One thing that I think is really helpful to note is that female or women friends in particular provide the most social support and provide greater relational closeness. So when we're talking about a skill set for improving your interpersonal communication with your family, friends, and romantic partner, it's important to know that healthy relationships are possible, regardless of any of these characteristics that we've talked about. And that there are several skills for a healthy communication that we can apply to improving all of these close relationships. First and foremost, and this is kind of a theme that you'll see all throughout today's talk, is being other-centered and taking on an empathy and perspective taking to try to understand the other person's point of view, to try to understand their perspective. That can be very healthy in a relationship. Sometimes, especially when there's some challenging times or maybe some problems that are going on, it can be really helpful to be mindful of the relationship's value to you. So remembering how important is this relationship and why is this relationship so important to you? Keeping that kind of at the forefront of your mind can help shape and frame the way that you interact and the way that you interpret and take meaning from those interactions. And with that comes this idea around being really mindful of the relationship's value to you. And part of that is recognizing that relational history. So thinking about the relational past or the history that you have together, and reminding yourself of that can help you to remind yourself of the importance of the relationship. Next is to find ways to keep the relationship alive. Now we hear a lot about this in people who've been married for a really long time, the relationship's getting into a bit of a rut, so you got to shake things up and make it spicy. But we also have to do that in our other non-romantic, non-sexual, non-marital relationships as well, right? We have to keep that relationship alive in all of our relationships. So, because patterns in relationships and these behaviors can become dull and unproductive and uninteresting. So it's important to try to remember to do new things together, gain new experiences together. And again, this is important among family relationships, friends, and of course, we know romantic couples. Then next on here, I have this recommendation of to practice random acts of kindness. And it's kind of because why not, right? If we're trying to invest in our relationships to make them really healthy, what types of things can we do to show kindness to the people who hold a special place in our hearts, right? People who are really important to us. Think about what type of random acts of kindness can you do to invest into that relationship. And then lastly, it's about being fair. Just ensure equity whenever possible. Equity and fairness comes in a lot of different forms, depending on the relationship and structure. But essentially caring about the other person in a relationship really requires communication that is both equitable and fair. So of course, we want to do all of these things because we care about our relationships and we want to keep them healthy. And part of maintaining healthy relationships involves relational maintenance. So just how we do auto maintenance, right? We get an oil change, we check the tire pressure, we do dental maintenance, we get teeth cleanings and checkups and physicals and all of that. We need to do the same type of work in our relationships. So there are some ways that we can engage in relational maintenance, or some goals more or less. And the first kind of baseline is to keep the relationship into existence, right? We just, at the very, very minimum, if we want the relationship to exist, we have to put work into keeping that relationship in existence. I'm sure you all have had people who were close relationships with and eventually just kind of drifted apart. That's because nobody was putting any effort into that relationship. Nobody was engaging in these maintenance behaviors or performing an oil change on the car, essentially, on the relationship. So we can keep a relationship in existence, again, that baseline. Then we can also engage in maintenance behaviors in an effort to kind of achieve a specified state or condition in the relationship. So maybe we've reached like a cool level where we've gotten to know each other, everything's cool, we're smooth sailing in the relationship, and we just want to keep it that way, right? We're not trying to get to know each other more necessarily, but we're like in a good place. So we engage in maintenance behaviors to keep it at that kind of homeostasis, even level. Then we also have, okay, maybe this, the way it is, isn't quite good enough. We want to keep it in a satisfactory condition, right? We want to be really satisfied in our relationships. And I think all of us here in this room and online, that's what we're really aiming for, right? We want satisfied relationships, not just to exist, and not just to kind of keep the status quo, but we really want to be satisfied and happy and healthy in our relationships. And sometimes there are challenges and struggles that happen, issues, conflicts that arise. And so we also have to sometimes engage in relational maintenance to repair that damage that's been done to the relationship. So maintenance behaviors can be characterized based on how pro-social or anti-social they are. And we can think of this in terms of kind of healthy versus unhealthy is an easy way to think of it. But are we contributing positively to our relationship with those pro-social maintenance behaviors, or are we contributing negatively? Are we harming the relationship with these anti-social behaviors? There's also some differences in terms of how they're employed, either strategically or routinely, right? Strategic relationship maintenance are intentionally designed behaviors to maintain that relationship, to either make it exist, keep it in a specific state, or to achieve that satisfactory condition or to repair it. And the routine are those less deliberate kind of routine things that we do, such as maybe asking about somebody's day, or my husband and I ask each other every morning how we slept that night or the night before. So just kind of the routine daily talk can also be a form of relationship maintenance as well. So when we look at these pro-social strategies, okay, so here's like really where the good stuff happens. How do we engage in healthy pro-social communication to invest in our relationships, to keep it in a satisfactory state? Maybe there's some issues going on in our relationship and we're going to try to repair that. So here are some things that we can do relating to pro-social maintenance behaviors. First and foremost, we can be positive. We can try to make our interactions as pleasant and enjoyable as possible. Sometimes this involves giving compliments, telling your romantic partner they look really nice today, or you like their new shirt. We can also just try to act more cheerful, try to act more positively. Sometimes you've heard the term, fake it till you make it. Sometimes if we just try to act a little bit more positive in our relationships, that can really set the whole tone, change the whole tone. Next is openness and routine talk. So this is just talking, listening to each other and making sure that you take the time to actually listen. This is self-disclosing, sharing secrets, maybe asking about your partner's day. We can also give assurances about our commitment to the relationship, maybe assuring that you still care, or sometimes this is talking about the future, can give assurances to our relational partners about our relationship. We can also spend time with each other's social network, maybe going to family functions together, accepting each other's friends in our own inner circles. And we can perform tasks together, performing routine chores that are relevant to the relationship, such as, hey, we'll go get your car's oil change. Oh, I keep thinking oil change. We'll go get your car's oil change and we'll take a walk together. So we're getting some of your stuff done, your responsibilities done, but also enjoying some time together. So those joint activities and task sharing. Supportiveness, giving each other emotional support and encouragement, providing comfort, and making sacrifices for your partner is another way to really invest in that relationship and engage in those pro-social behaviors. Then we also have romance and affection. So if your relationship has a romantic component to it, you can reveal positive, caring feelings for one another, saying I love you, sending flowers, a romantic dinner on Valentine's Day. We can also use humor to invest in our relationship, to have those pro-social behaviors, such as telling an inside joke or being silly, trying to laugh together, finding a way that you can use inside jokes, humor, maybe sarcasm, funny nicknames, just a way to laugh together and have a good time together. And then lastly is constructive conflict. Constructive conflict management is about going through and working through those issues in such a way that you promote problem solving and harmony. This is really listening to your partner's positions and trying to come up with acceptable solutions that work for everyone. And we'll talk more about the conflict management strategies in a few minutes, but I do want to spend just a little bit of time talking about those antisocial behaviors or those unhealthy communication behaviors. In other words, things that you don't want to do in your relationship. Now, little caveat to that is, while I'm going to sit up here and say, don't do this, we're always working on these things. Chances are you've done at least one of these. I know I have, but we're always working, we're always growing. So even if you've done one of these things, just try to keep in mind that next time, try to avoid that and try engaging with those pro-social behaviors instead. So these antisocial maintenance behaviors, these behaviors that put your relationship in disrepair or have potential to damage or otherwise be unhealthy for the relationship. If you avoid your partner, right? If you're avoiding either being around them in general, or if you're avoiding certain topics that kind of leave holes or gaps within the relationship, if you start planning maybe separate activities, and sometimes it's kind of under this disguise of, I'm trying to respect your privacy, but really you're kind of driving a wedge and avoiding the other person. Another antisocial behavior that people do sometimes is called jealousy induction. This is a way to kind of attempt to make your relational partner jealous in romantic relationships. Maybe it's like letting them believe that you have like a romantic interest, or letting them see you flirting with somebody, to try to induce jealousy, to make them maybe realize what they're missing. But really, that's a very antisocial maintenance behavior that we want to try to avoid. Spying. I feel like this kind of goes without saying, but it's so easy with direct messages and text messages and phones and all of this, that going through your partner's phone or getting information without their knowledge is really not a healthy way to engage or invest in your relationship. Similarly with infidelity. And then there's this other one, allowing control. So allowing control is this one that sounds like, okay, well, I'm kind of giving in, I'm conceding, I'm compromising, but we want to make sure that we're not giving too much control. Meaning it gets into the unhealthy territory when we start doing things such as leaving our own hobbies, ditching our own friends to just focus on the romantic partnership, right? If you're forgetting about kind of who you are as the core person and your own hobbies and activities, the things that are important to you, and investing everything into this relationship, then it's probably not very healthy. So we want to make sure that we have our own hobbies and interests going on while also being a part of that relationship. And making sure that you both have equal control, behavioral control in that relationship. That it's not all one person making the decisions about what you're going to have for dinner that night, but rather you're working together and making decisions together. It's not an uneven distribution of power or decision making. Lastly is destructive conflict. So this is kind of that antithesis of, the harmful type of conflict. This could be yelling at your partner if they don't do what you want, or starting an argument with them to try to get your way. And I'll talk about some other less healthy conflict management strategies in just a minute here. But there are some certain behaviors that we focus on depending on the relationship stage and type. And I find that sometimes this can be helpful to look at so you can kind of know, okay, am I doing kind of what's the status quo? Or maybe there's something that I can work on given my own relationship stage and where we are. So for instance, married and engaged couples use more assurances, right? Talking about their commitment and their goals for the future together, and task sharing, so accomplishing those household chores together. Engaged and seriously dating couples tend to use more openness and positivity. And we could argue and say, well, if they're engaged or seriously dating, they're kind of in that courtship phase. So there would be more openness, more disclosure happening in that earlier stages. Married couples use the most amount of social networking. So bringing in family functions, going to events together, right? Kind of considering each other a core unit in social settings. In gay and lesbian relationships, in particular, it's really important to live and work in environments that are not judgmental of their relationships. So make sure that you're surrounding yourself in your life at work with people who are supportive of your relationships. It's especially important to be out in front of social networks and spending time with friends and family members who recognize and accept their relationship is really a key relational maintenance behavior for LGBTQ folks. There are three maintenance behaviors that are particularly important in friendships. Openness, right? So sharing details, disclosures, supportiveness, encouraging one another and being there for one another, and positivity, right? That cheerfulness and engaging in that positive character. When it comes to friendships, I know I've mentioned this before, but I feel it's worth reiterating. Men and women, we're not from different planets, right? We're not from Mars or Venus. We're from Earth, and we're actually more similar than we are dissimilar. Everyone wants a friend to talk to. Everyone wants a friend to do things with. Everyone wants someone who they can turn to in times of trouble, regardless of your biological sex, your gender, your sexual orientation, any of those things. We all want special people in our lives. The thing is that with these friendships, women's friendships are more about face-to-face and talking, and men's friendships are more about side-by-side or doing things together. And this is really the only—
What are you doing, Cooper?
Difference. Cooper. And that's really the only notable difference, but I do think it's worth noting that this is not universal across the board. There are certainly some women who don't like to talk, and there's some men who really want to talk about their feelings and emotions. So it's not universal. However, with these cross-sex relationships, cross-sex friendships, there are some challenges that can pop up. There's an emotional bond challenge where if you're best friends, but maybe you sometimes can't quite help thinking about each other as potential romantic partners or something more than just friends. So again, I'm talking about cross-sex friendships here. There could also be a sexual challenge or a coping with romantic intent or sexual interest, right? If one partner or both have a potential interest, you have to figure out a way to reconcile that within your friendship. Which can also kind of come up continually with this public presentation, right? So I don't know if how many of you have a cross-sex best friend, but when you go in public, you always like think that you're the couple, and you have to continuously say, no, that's just my friend, there's nothing going on here. And so that can be a challenge, a burden for cross-sex friends to have to deal with. In terms of long distance relationships, of course, there's this lack of face-to-face communication, a lack of affection, of nonverbal affection, a lack of activity and task sharing. There's also a potential in long distance relationships to idealize their relationship or to romanticize it, right? To kind of put it up on this pedestal where maybe it doesn't quite belong, but because you don't spend a lot of intricate routine time together, we kind of elevate that long distance relationship. And then with cohabiting relationships, so living together but not married, potentially yet, these challenges really surround relationship stability and quality, kind of questioning the stability and possibly assurances about the future. So both partners pay attention to the relationship, even when it's not experiencing trouble. There's always potential for trouble to come up. So it's best to do some of that preventative maintenance on your relationship, just like you do with your car, you're at the dentist for your teeth. So now let's talk about some of the specific skills that we can do for relational maintenance. We can, again, offer those assurances. This relationship is really important to me. We can express openness. This is how I feel. This is how I feel about you. We can reflect positivity. I really enjoy spending time with you. You're such a great person. We can share those tasks that we've talked about, right? Let's clean the house and then we'll go out for lunch together. And we can activate our social networks, right? Invite your best friends along with you when you go out together. And then of course, continue to express support and offer help and see the ways that you can help make each other's lives better. It's also necessary to develop a supportive communication climate. So this is a climate where everyone feels safe to engage with one another and feels comfortable. And the way that we can help to cultivate this supportive communication climate is in being really careful in the way that we frame things. So, for example, if we're making comments, it's important to make descriptive rather than evaluative comments. So we just want to describe the things that we're observing, right? Stating facts instead of assigning value to it. So for example, you could say, hey, I noticed the trash didn't get taken out, instead of saying, I don't know why you're so useless and you can't ever take the trash out. Like, we don't need to assign value, we just need to state facts, right? And so doing those types of things can be really helpful. We can also speak in provisional ways rather than in an absolute manner, right? Hey, I noticed the trash didn't take out, maybe you forgot, right? In that tentative way, instead of you are always forgetting, you never do what you say you're going to do, instead of that type of thing, we can say maybe this happened, or maybe you need a little help or you're feeling overwhelmed, kind of giving them the benefit of the doubt. We can also try to be more spontaneous rather than strategic. So really trying to be authentic. I know some people kind of, when they're going into interactions or having any serious talks in their relationships, they kind of premeditate what they think that the interaction is going to be like. And so we want to try to withhold that premeditative, here's what's going to happen. And instead, really approach it from this authentic, genuine place of just being your true self, so you can be in the moment and be mindful and be other-centered and really focus on what they have to say in response to you. We can also strive for a problem orientation rather than a control orientation. So we don't want to necessarily always have it our way, right? It's nice to have it my way, but what I'm really focused on is solving the problems, is coming up with solutions. So if we can kind of abandon the mentality that my way is the right way or the only way, then it can leave ourselves open to have a more problem orientation in our relationships. Again, I keep going back to this idea around providing empathy to your partner. We want to make sure that we're being responsive to our partner instead of being neutral, right? If we don't act phased or we act neutral to them, then they might take it as we don't care or we're not invested or interested. And again, we want to make sure that we're establishing equality between partners rather than a superiority of one over the other. So we never want to make our partner feel that we think we're better than them. And similarly, they should never make us feel that they think that we're better, that they're better than us as well. So that's also really important. So problems will happen. Conflict will arise, right? Conflict is inevitable. And conflict is inevitable because going back to that definition about close relationships, we're interdependent. We're dependent on one another. We have mutual interests and we have goals. And sometimes those goals are incompatible with one another. And that's when conflict comes up. So conflict is inevitable. But the thing is, knowing that it will happen doesn't necessarily make it any easier, but it does help us to understand this is normal. This is healthy. This is okay to engage in conflict, especially because there are constructive, healthy ways to engage in conflict. And of course, these less healthy ways to engage in conflict as well. One thing that I did want to mention about conflict is that we have this paradoxical nature of hurt in our close relationships, meaning that it's people that we are closest to that have the power to hurt us in ways that other people simply cannot. So because of that, we have to really think about conflict and make sure that we're framing it in a way that can help be supportive of our relationships. Because we know that conflict is most likely to occur in close relationships, especially within families and romantic relationships. But again, it's normal, it's healthy, but it can be problematic. So I do want to talk about some ways that it can be problematic, but first I just want to point out, here's a table of common conflict issues in various relationships, parents and their young children versus teens, among siblings and young married couples. And as you can see, and have likely experienced yourself, the topic of conflict can vary by relationship type, and it's influenced by factors such as age, sex, gender, family structure, culture, patterns, and styles of conflict. Women and men have been taught a set of responsibilities and norms that affect our conflict interactions. And so because of socialization, there's this imbalance of men's and women's desires to talk about relationship issues. However, again, it's important to note that not all women and men have been socialized to the same degree. So we have differing practices and norms that may put us in conflict or opposition with one another. So conflict patterns can vary and can be dictated by conflict styles. So maybe think about a couple you know that's been together for years and how they, maybe this is you, how you seem to fight over the same topics over and over again. Maybe some of those topics listed on the previous slide, most common. And we tend to see some patterns within the ways couples fight or relational partners engage in conflict. And that could be marked by escalation or withdrawal, meaning do you come at it as a fight or do you kind of retreat and flee away? We can also look at it as symmetrical or asymmetrical, meaning do you both come to the conflict ready to fight, or do you both retreat? That would be symmetrical, or is it asymmetrical? One wants to really pursue and the other one wants to withdraw, and vice versa. So that's kind of one way of thinking about how do we approach conflict. And we engage in conflict styles in a way to cope with conflict. And this is all based on levels of concern for the self and concern for others, as you see on the diagram up here. So over on the high concern for self, low concern for others, we have competitors. So competitors tend to argue their case and insist on the merits of their point of view. Oh, and I forgot to mention, maybe as I'm going through these, think about, okay, what's your kind of go-to conflict style? We can save this for another time, but there's assessments that you can do that really figure out what your conflict style is. I do think it's worth noting that none of these are a surefire way to fix conflict or prevent conflict. We have to take each situation as it is and try to approach it with the most healthy way. And there's some other strategies that we'll talk about in a minute here. But going back to the styles, we have competitors again, approach conflict. They want to fight to win, right? They're like, I know I'm right. I'm usually always right. And I'm going to fight this. And I enjoy it, right? I enjoy kind of the battle of the wits and arguing or debating just for the delight of debating. They try to figure out what's done and again, think they're usually right. Then we have accommodators who are high in concern for others, but low in concern for self. And they really try to just meet the expectations of others. They try to accommodate the wishes of their friends and families. And they just like to give in to keep the peace. They're like, you know what, this isn't worth it. I don't want to rock the boat. So I'm just going to focus on everybody else's feelings, keeping everybody else happy, and completely put my feelings, thoughts, and opinions to the wayside. You can see how other people might really appreciate that, but how it might not be so healthy for you if you're an accommodator. Collaborators, on the other hand, high concern for self and others, explore issues with others to try to find solutions that meet everyone's needs. Now, if there would be an ideal style, this is probably it. You might be thinking, well, what about compromising? We'll talk about that one in a second. But collaborators try to gather as much information as possible and keep the lines of communication open and really strive to see both sides. And so they approach conflict asking kind of key questions around, okay, what's needed here? What does my relational partner need? What are the issues involved and how do we fix these issues? So really kind of instrumentally focused on solving the problem and working together. Compromisers, on the other hand, they try to negotiate and adopt this kind of give and take approach, right? You're all familiar with compromising, right? You give in a little, I'll give in a little, and we'll meet somewhere in the middle. The problem with that, while it's helpful because you can compromise and just move on, the problem with that is nobody's actually ever truly satisfied. So if I want Thai food and you want pizza and we decide to get a Thai food pizza, like, I don't know if either of us are actually going to be satisfied with that solution. Maybe, I don't know, I never tried it, I shouldn't knock it. So while compromise can be a good idea, especially if you're not super involved in the issue, if it's an issue you're like, okay, this is clearly more important to my partner than it is to me, then sure, go on and compromise. But if it's something that's really important to you, then compromise might not be the best solution. And then lastly, we have avoiders, low concern for self, low concern for others. These are the people who tend to say very little and try to leave the conflict as soon as possible. They feel very anxious and very uncomfortable in conflict and would rather just like avoid any difficult or hard feelings and just keep your opinions to yourself. So just not engaging at all. So you can see there are some benefits to using some of these conflict styles in certain situations. And when conflict is constant and not managed well, negative consequences can ensue, but there are many benefits to handling conflict constructively. So handling conflict constructively or in a helpful way can help to kind of get the feelings out in the open. It can be very cathartic, where maybe you're holding your emotions, your thoughts in, you can just let it all out and be cathartic and feel that release. It can also help to increase your knowledge and understanding of the other person and to help them to understand you better, which then in turn promotes feelings of confidence and trustworthiness. It also can promote genuine human contact and interaction, which then leads to increased intimacy, closeness. It can also, engaging in constructive conflict can also maximize our chances of good decision making, right? When we collaborate, we work together to find the solutions that work best for us collectively, then it's likely that we're going to make a better choice versus if we hadn't discussed the issue. And then lastly, it can help to shake a relationship out of a rut. So even though, especially any avoiders around here don't want to engage in the conflict, but if you do, it can actually kind of shake up and maybe make the relationship for the better. Okay, so what about when conflict isn't so constructive? What about when it's not so great? What are the things that you should look out for? So this is from a psychologist, Dr. John Gottman, who is a marital and family therapist, and he has identified 4 key concepts or issues that ultimately will kind of guarantee to lead to the demise of a relationship. So these are 4 things that we do not want to do, right? And I'm not just going to tell you don't do them, I'm also going to tell you how to handle them if they do come up. But so let's talk about these 4 issues. First is criticism. So criticisms are these personal attacks that blame the person for things that are happening, right? You're useless, or, I don't know why I can't ever count on you, those types of things, right? Blaming the person rather than A complaint, which we don't want to do a whole lot of, but a complaint would be focusing on that specific behavior, right? The trash didn't get taken out again, right? So instead of blaming the person or focusing on the personality, we can focus on that act. Defensiveness involves defending oneself, right? Saying, this is all you, this is not me, this is not a me problem. You've done all the issues here, and this is not my issue to deal with. Contempt can communicate an air of superiority, right? Just that thing that I was telling you we want to avoid. We never want to make our partner feel that we think that we are better than them. Similarly, that they shouldn't make us feel that way as well. Interesting thing with contempt is that, you know, it communicates this air of superiority, and it's often the byproduct of very long-standing problems in the relationships. When a lot of resentment starts to build up, then it kind of leads to that contempt. So the chances are we've gotten to the contempt part, then we really need to backtrack and put a lot of effort and repair into that relationship. And then lastly is stonewalling. So this usually occurs after criticism, defense, and contempt, and can actually become very pervasive in the relationship. And this is just stonewalling is cutting out, just completely shutting off. You know, we think of this as maybe the silent treatment or just shutting out. This is stonewalling. Contempt and stonewalling are particularly toxic in relationships. And interestingly enough, stonewalling can look a lot like avoiding in conflict too. So we want to make sure that we're kind of keeping those things distinguished in terms of what's my conflict style versus am I actually stonewalling my partner, or is it just that I'm worried about engaging in a conflict? So thankfully, Dr. Gottman gives us a few solutions to these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, or the 4 concepts that can lead to the demise of your relationship. And the first suggestion is to use I statements, right? I think, I feel, I want. Make sure to treat each other with respect and appreciation. Try to keep in mind how important this person is to you and how valuable that relationship is. It's also necessary to accept at least some responsibility, even if it's only for part of the conflict, right? To acknowledge the way that you have contributed to the overall situation. This can be really helpful, especially in terms of kind of keeping away from that contempt, right? Acknowledging, hey, I contributed to this too. I've done some things that weren't perfect either. And then when all else fails, if you're just so emotionally overwhelmed and flooded, or find yourself, you know, those emotions are really kicking into high gear, or especially if you find yourself or your partner stonewalling, it's best to take a break from one another and do something pleasant for 20 to 30 minutes. Go for a walk outside, listen to some relaxing music, do something peaceful and pleasant. That way, after those 20, 30 minutes, you can come back to the interaction with calm and more positive frame of mind to then resume the discussion. Now, using these suggestions can be extremely hard, even when we know better. We can revert back to our old habits and our own conflict patterns. So I think it's worth just going over a couple more strategies for effective conflict management. Kind of going back to that elevated emotional state, when others get really hot or emotionally elevated, one of the things that we can do is lighten up and reframe. Right, lightening up refers to your own ability to keep a cool head, to stay, you know, even-keeled, level-minded, especially when others start to get hot emotionally. We can also keep our nonverbal communication genuine, and maybe changing something that has a negative connotation into another one. So maybe you're in a really in-depth, emotionally charged discussion. You can take a minute to acknowledge it and be like, I'm so glad we're taking the time to talk about this and invest in our relationship. So even though it's really difficult in that moment, that conflict, to take a moment to step away and just acknowledge that I'm grateful that we're spending this time putting in this work in a relationship can be really helpful. So. We can also make sure to presume goodwill. So go into each conflict interaction believing that both you and your partner want good stuff to come out of the conflict, come out of the resolution. So if we go in with the intent of goodwill and assume goodwill on the behalf of our relational partner, that can be really helpful as well. And this could be simply saying, just acknowledging, I'm sure we both want this conflict or this issue to be resolved constructively. sometimes it's helpful to think about kind of a ratio of, and that's why I have a scale up here, of how many negative comments are you making in that conflict versus how many positive comments are you making in that conflict. And going back again to psychologist John Gottman, he says that there's this magic ratio of positive to negative in marriage, which is 5 to 1. So if you want to have a successful marriage, and I think this applies to other relationships as well, but if you want to have a successful marriage, it's best to say 5 positive things for every 1 negative thing that you say. So that's just the extent to which we have to really work at. So every complaint, every criticism, everything negative that you say, we should try to offset that by saying 5 or more positive things. We can also ask questions, focusing on the other person. Think about, what do we want to do to resolve this situation? And then listen, right? Engage in that other-centered, active listening, practice that person-centeredness, and really be mindful and tune in to your own personality, your own feelings and emotions, your own assumptions before evaluating or judging your partner. And we can demonstrate this acknowledgement by saying something like, it's clear that we're both coming at this from different perspectives. Just acknowledging that we're coming at it from different perspectives can help us to gain some clarity and insight from that. So remember that relational maintenance is aimed at keeping things moving along, whereas repair is focused on correcting that problem. And so those who are highly committed in their relationships, right, family and marital relationships, they're likely to use pro-relationship behaviors or pro-social behaviors when they encounter problems in their relationship. And so I've come up with this little SAS acronym here that we want to, the pro-social relationship behaviors that we can engage in are first a decision to stay in that relationship, right? You decide to remain in the relationship. Then we can accommodate our partner. We can give in to our partner's needs, demands, requests within reason. And we can show a willingness to make sacrifices if needed, right? And part of that giving in is, okay, I'm willing to make a sacrifice for you to make you happy. And then we need to perceive relationship superiority. So again, this is not about self-superiority, but we need to remember how amazing and wonderful our relationship is so that we can continue to invest in that relationship and ensure those constructive outcomes. Now, these problems and issues and conflicts arise, and sometimes they require apologies. And so effective apologies have several parts, and I'll try to keep this brief because I know we're running a little short on time here, but an apology should have an expression of remorse. So expressing that I acknowledge, I feel bad for my behaviors or my feelings or my actions. A promise to not repeat that transgression, right? Show an appreciation. I appreciate this opportunity to learn and grow and change and do better. And then an acknowledgement of fault, an acknowledgement of the other person's pain, to really take ownership of the damage that's been caused by the issue. And then a promise to make it up and a commitment to rectify those harmful behaviors. And then lastly is an explicit request for forgiveness. I think oftentimes we kind of forget that part. Like, I am seeking forgiveness. This is what I'm looking for. Then on the opposite side, forgiveness is this relational process that has these characteristics that kind of go hand in hand with an apologies. There has to be an acknowledgement of the harmful conduct, right? You can't just dismiss it and say, yeah, I forgive you. No, we need to acknowledge the harmful conduct. And then we need to make a decision to give mercy. We need to kind of give an extension of undeserved mercy. They did something wrong, and so we need to give mercy for that. Then we also need to engage in an emotional transformation. So we need to let go of negative feelings. That's a really important part about forgiveness, is this emotional transformation. And then sometimes we need to engage in relationship renegotiation, right? So we had a problem come up in the relationship. Now we need to figure out what are the ways in which we need to maybe manage or negotiate the rules and expectations for the future of our relationship now that we've had this issue happen. So we can show forgiveness in a variety of different ways, explicitly saying it, we can be conditional when we say it. But I just want to leave you with a couple of things that we're more likely to grant forgiveness and use positive communication with our partners. First of all, when the transgression is not that serious. So if it's infidelity, we might argue is like a super serious one, and forgiveness might not be possible for that. But if it's forgetting to take out the trash, well, I think we can, it's not that serious, so we can let it slide. An important note is that even with the more serious transgressions, that even if we assess them as super serious right now, we might later reassess and decide, you know what, it was a really big deal to me a month ago, but now I'm starting to understand that it's not as extreme as it needs to be. So we can always reassess that. And then another important indicator of granting forgiveness is if the relationship quality was really high prior to the indiscretion or the transgression. So if we have a high quality, highly rewarding relationship, then we're more likely to forgive. So it's just all to say that it's all the more reason to really invest in those relationships, to really engage in those pro-social, healthy relationship maintenance behaviors. So just to wrap up, I went over some of those characteristics of close relationships and talks about the ways that we get our needs fulfilled. I talked about some pro-social and antisocial or healthy and unhealthy communication behaviors, conflict management strategies, and some specific skills for repairing and rebuilding relationships, including those apologies and forgiveness. So I hope you have learned something here to help make your communication a little bit more healthy and your relationships healthy as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we are going to go ahead and open the floor for questions. If you are virtual and you have questions, you can go ahead and place them in the chat. And then for anyone in the room, if you would like to go ahead and ask any questions that you have at this time.
What is the difference between contempt and stonewalling?
Oh, good question. So contempt is when it's this air of superiority, right? It's like, I'm better than you. I'm kind of putting my nose up in the air and I'm like, you're beneath me, you're less than me. So it's more about like, I'm better, I'm higher power than you. And so a lot of times that can be having more control in the relationship versus stonewalling is just shutting out. You don't really know, they might think that you're better than you, but you really have no way of knowing because they're just like a stone wall, right? It's just like a statue that you're talking or trying to interact with, and they're just not giving you any reaction or response whatsoever. So both of those obviously very damaging and unhealthy for a relationship, especially that stonewalling. When we start to get into stonewalling into relationships, that's something that we really want to potentially seek outside help, maybe marital and family therapists, that type of stonewalling behavior can be really damaging in relationships.
Thank you. Is there a way that you can change the other person's perspective to say, you're not better than me? You're just being a jerk.
Right. Yeah, so changing the other person's perspective is hard. One of the ways that we can do that is we can show up and display and model how we have adjusted our perspective. So we can say, you know what, I came into this interaction assuming the worst about your intentions, thinking that you did it to intentionally hurt me, or that you just think you're better than me, or whatever. So that's how I first approached it. But now I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to acknowledge that maybe that perspective needs some adjustment. And so if you model, right, being flexible and tentative in your assessments of the situation, then you can hopefully have your relational partner do the same thing, right? And you can also invite them. Okay, now that I've shared my perspective on the interaction, how about you share with me your perspective of the situation? Now, when we know that they're being a jerk, that can be really hard to just zip it, right? Just close your mouth and let them speak, because sometimes they just have to get it out. And as I mentioned before, that contempt is oftentimes a signal that there's something else going on. So if they're just being a jerk, then chances are it's not just because they're a jerk, but that there's some other issue or problem going on under the surface that they're not talking about. So if contempt is happening, then let's try to uncover why they think they're better than you. What's the problem going on that maybe we're not seeing that they can help us to better understand?
So how do I go about doing that?
And by that, you mean talking to them about
Trying to figure out the underlying whatever's going on.
So a big piece of that is asking questions and making sure, and this is the hardest part, making sure that when you ask questions, you give them the full floor. And one of my favorite things to say, because I have a hard time in doing this, I like taking it, oh, so you meant this, so you meant that, is zip it, take a step and say, is there anything else that you would like to add? Is there anything else that's going on that you would like to share with me? Is there anything else that you feel like you would want to talk to me about right now since we're having this discussion? And if you keep asking those probing questions, I bet you'd have a little bit of luck with starting to uncover what the actual kind of hidden problem might be. That would be my recommendation. Okay. Good luck.
I want to say thank you for your advice. I was not aware, like, crappy, apologize. We unconscious about that when sometimes we offend our family or husband or friends. We say, "I'm just kidding." It happened often, but the other person, it's not feel like it was just kidding. So it was amazing. I taking away this today.
Good. And that's it. When it comes to, these relational transgressions, if the other person minimizes it, says, oh, it's not a big deal, don't worry about it, or it was just a joke, when it's actually a problem, that can be an issue, right? But if it's really not a problem and they can minimize it and say no big deal, well then, okay, now we know we can actually move on. But that can be the tricky part, is knowing what's authentic.
It is, yeah. So,
And that's where it really comes to our job to model that, to model authentic, genuine interactions and honesty.
yeah, how when someone hurt you and then say, "I'm just kidding," why?
Right.
What is the best reaction? What we have to do?
So if they hurt you and they say they're just kidding, this is where, so when people are offended, it doesn't matter what the other person's intent was, and this is common in intercultural communication, interracial communication, it doesn't matter what their intent was. The point is that you have hurt feelings about that. And that's where those I messages come into handy. I feel hurt. I feel sad. I want you to know that even though you said it's a joke, it still impacted me deeply.
Okay, yeah, that's amazing. Thank you.
Great questions. So we have a few in the chat here. The first one says, can you please explain why some gaslights?
Okay. So gaslighting, I mean, that's a whole other topic. We could spend a whole hour talking about gaslighting. I think that there's a lot of reasons why people gaslight. What I found is it's mostly out of defensiveness, that they just don't want to face that it's possible that they could have done something wrong. That's in my experience what I've seen is when they're saying, oh, it's all in your head or you're making it up. They just don't want to deal with that conflict. They don't want to acknowledge that the issue even exists. And they're like, oh, you're just making it up. So dismissing it and pretending like it doesn't exist is an easy way for people to be like, no sweat off my back anymore. That's all in your head. You're making it up. So they can kind of get off easy street that way.
So final two questions. The first one says, regarding destructive conflict, what advice would you give to someone who experiences hidden destructive conflict in a relationship, such as broken promises, reminding one of past mistakes, or putting one down in front of others, even in a joking manner?
Yeah, that's really tricky. When you started to get into these public displays of the critiques and the criticisms and complaints, derogating your own partner, it can be extremely problematic. This is when we're starting to get into territory where we really actually need to think about, is this relationship truly healthy? If this is somebody who's treating you like this all the time, every time you go out and they are always making you feel this way, first of all, we need to make sure that we're engaging in that effective conflict management, right? Talking about the issues, explaining how you feel, describing your thoughts, feelings, observations, experiences, and getting their perspective on it, right? It could be that's their way of engaging in humor. I know a lot of men especially tend to engage in like the nagging humor, the negging, kind of teasing, and it's the way of like flirting. It's really silly, but sometimes people don't realize how hurtful it can be, where they think they're just kind of poking and teasing and prodding and having fun, but it can actually be really quite damaging. So I would encourage the question asker first to have a discussion with your partner about the things that you're observing and the ways that it's making you feel. And then take it from there. See what type, are they willing to, reflect on the ways that they've been making you feel? Are they willing to adjust their communication in future interactions? If yes, well then great, then we can keep making progress and we can keep making these improvements. If not, well then I think we need to go back to decide, are your needs really being fulfilled in this close relationship? Or are you being more harmed than you're getting out of it?
Thank you. And our final question is there a timeline of relational maintenance assessments, especially if we notice antisocial practices? Do we communicate ramifications without ultimatums?
So ramifications is a tricky word, kind of umbrella ramifications. Of course, we want to steer clear of ultimatums, but I do think it's worth talking about the way that these destructive behaviors are making you feel. And again, this goes back to those I statements, right? Talking about I'm observing, I feel, this is what I'm experiencing, and let your partner know about that, right? I'm observing that you're avoiding me, or I'm observing that you're trying to make me jealous, or when we go to a party, you immediately leave me and go start talking to every other woman in the room instead of being by my side, or whatever it is. Like, tell them about your observation, how it's making you feel, and then try to see how can we maybe pivot this to adjust it. One of the ways that's a nice way to kind of dip this into the conversation is say, hey, I just went to this really cool talk about healthy communication. And one thing that I learned is that something that I've been doing is really not healthy. And these are the unhealthy behaviors that I've learned. And these are the healthy behaviors that I've learned. And here are the things that I know I'm going to do to be better. And again, modeling that to your partner and sharing the things that you've learned can be really helpful as well.
Well, thank you so much for all of your time answering questions. Can we give her I have a few slides here to end out our presentation today. So I want to first thank you all for joining us this afternoon, whether you're here in person or virtually. We're really excited to have this hybrid opportunity for our Health and Wellness Awareness Series. So we hope that you will plan to join us again. If you leave today and you still have questions or you have comments for us, you can email us at healtheducator@thewomensfund.org. I know I say this every time, but it really does happen that I leave a presentation and then the next day I'm still thinking about it and I have questions. So definitely feel free to reach out to us. I will include that email and that email address in a follow-up email that I send after today we conclude. I'll also be sending a survey link, so we would really appreciate if you would take a few moments to provide us with some feedback. Let us know what you liked about the presentation, what we can do better, and also topics that you're interested in hearing more about. I've included our social media pages and our website link. I encourage you to follow us on social media. We update regularly about things that we have going on at the Women's Fund, including these presentations as well as others. As far as our upcoming events, on the 8th, we have a presentation with the University of Houston downtown. It's a lecture series. So last year we did a presentation over COVID vaccines, and we have Dr. Mazoon coming back to give an update a year later. And then later in the month of March, on the 23rd, we have another Health and Wellness Awareness Series over nutrition. So that event is currently up on our website if you would like to go and register. We're working to get the UHD event up on our website at this time. But again, I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Winkler, for a wonderful, wonderful, very informative presentation, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.
Ending live video.
All right.